Good evening. I'm Perry Bolton, Acting Chairman of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. Welcome to what I know you will find to be a very, very interesting address. I would like to thank Black & Decker and Maryland National for the nice wine and cheese reception. And before my and our co-sponsor, the World Center Institute. Before my brief introduction, Mr. Polda is representing the mayor and would like to make a presentation to Ambassador Hermes.
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, Mayor William Don Schaefer regrets that he cannot be present on this occasion, but I have the privilege and the honor of representing him on this occasion. The mayor is always delighted when dignitaries or other visitors come to this city, but the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs has been particularly significant in adding another dimension to this city and brings in visitors or speakers who add another dimension to our knowledge of world affairs. I have the honor, sir, to present to you the ceremonial plate of the city of Baltimore. Your Excellency, this is the plate of the city of Baltimore. And as another measure of welcome by Mayor William Don Schaefer, I may, with your permission, read a citation. City of Baltimore Honorary Citizenship to Peter Hermes. In honor of your visit to our city, I, William Don Schaefer, Mayor of the City of Baltimore, am pleased to extend a cordial welcome and to issue this certificate of honorary citizenship, given under the corporate seal of the City of Baltimore, the 29th of June in the year of our Lord, 1983, signed William Don Schaefer, Mayor.
Thank you.
Following the ambassador's address, he will answer a few questions. I urge the membership to be brief and to the point with their questions. I will be brief in my introduction, since the importance of the ambassador's position and the importance of the foreign policy positions of his country are self-evident in their importance. Dr. Hermes was born in Berlin in 1922. As a law student, he was called up to serve in the German army in 1941. He was taken prisoner of war by the Russians in 1945 and released after 5 years in 1950. He then resumed his studies and received his doctorate in 1952. In 1953, he joined the diplomatic service. As a further personal aside, it's of interest that both his father and his father-in-law were determined opponents of Nazism. Both were imprisoned and sentenced to death in the aftermath of the bomb plot against Hitler in July 20th, 1944. In September of that year, his father-in-law was executed. The war ended before the sentence on his father could be carried out. Ambassador Hermes became ambassador to the United States for the Federal Republic of Germany in 1979. Prior to his appointment as ambassador, he served in a wide variety of capacities for his government, including responsibilities for international economic policy, aid policy, European economic integration, and in the field of nuclear research and the peaceful use of nuclear energy. He also was charged with negotiating trade agreements with Eastern European countries, China, the United States, and Britain. It is a great pleasure and an honor to welcome the distinguished ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany, Peter Hermes, to the Council.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to be in Baltimore again and to speak to the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, I'm sorry. As you know, I am not very far from here, posted, and it gives me every time coming to Baltimore a special pleasure, because from the first time I came here in fall of '79, I've seen such an immense improvement of the harbor area that Baltimore is in a state of ever going on beautification. And for a visitor from Washington, I was certainly thrilled to come here. May I ask you, Mr. Bolter, who were so kind to give me the greetings of the mayor and this document about the honorary citizenship, extend to the mayor my gratitude and my warm feelings. And Mayor Schaefer has been not unknown to me. I have met him several times in the city before. And well, I might mention, I think it seems not very inappropriate for a German ambassador to mention that this mayor is also at least of some German descent. Let me start with this. As you may know, this year, 1983, marks the tricentennial anniversary of German settlement in America. 13 Mennonite and Quaker families from Krefeld, Germany, where over the last weekend we celebrated this event, the departure event, together with Vice President George Bush and our fellow President and our fellow Chancellor. And it was a marvelous occasion. Even it was clouded a little bit by some turmoil in the streets, but that is really a side effect which we should not focus too much upon. So these 13 Mennonite families from Krefeld, Germany, crossed the ocean in 1683 to settle in what today is known as Germantown, now a part of the city of Philadelphia. They came here in search of freedom to pursue their religious beliefs and in order to find economic betterment for themselves and their children. They found a home, freedom, and opportunity. Across the centuries, almost 7 million more Germans followed. Their descendants, more than 52 million Americans, today form the largest single ethnic group in this country. In coming here today as German ambassador, I also paid tribute to the city of Baltimore, which was the center of early German settlement. The first known German colonist was a butcher, Andreas Steiger. After he had opened his business, the city's first brewery was set up by the brothers Barnetts as early as 1748. Then a German Protestant church was established 7 years later. German settlers, however, rarely followed that pattern of urbanization. As a rule, beer had less priority. During the War of Independence, there was a German regiment set up in Maryland, and most of the members of this regiment, and I saw the list, the enrollment list, very recently, most of these German soldiers came from Baltimore and Frederick. And after the War of Independence, many of the Germans who had served in the German regiment of Maryland mingled with those Hessians who served with the British, and they all stayed on. In 1850, Baltimore counted 20,000 German-born people among its inhabitants, and 40,000 in 1890. They had their schools, clubs, and newspapers. All this belongs to a rich history in the nation building of the United States. The days of sizable German immigration to the United States are over. The forebears of those 52 million Americans, among them the tens of thousands of German-born Baltimoreans, have been absorbed into the mainstream. They all have added some specific German ingredient to the American pageant and heritage. Meanwhile, and this I consider precious, the many Americans of German descent remember the European roots. This has also been proved by the recent survey of both the American public and national leaders, which was conducted in November and December '82 under the sponsorship of the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. This time it's relations. When they were asked which out of 24 listed countries they felt most favorably for, West Germany ranked fourth, behind Canada and Great Britain, and almost equaled France and Mexico. And when asked which country they perceive as being most important to American interests, they answered West Germany, followed by Great Britain and Japan. In his proclamation dedicated to this year's tricentennial celebration, President Reagan remarked that, I quote, "Despite the legacy of 2 world wars, which found us on opposing sides, West Germany and the United States have forged an exceptionally close relationship during the past 3 decades." And he went on to say that the success of the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, and the ensuing NATO partnership have led to a recognition of our common democratic ideals and joint interest in Western economic and political strengths. And recently, on last Saturday, Vice President George Bush handed a letter to Chancellor Kohl of President Ronald Reagan, and in this letter the President stated again that ours is shared history, of shared ideals, and of many, many personal and human and family ties. And he said that the United States and the Federal Republic of Germany have developed an exceptionally high degree of agreement on almost all questions facing the West in the 1980s. The Marshall Plan, of course, the airlift, the founding days of the NATO alliance have gone down in history as superb achievements of the Western world. America gave the decisive impulses for the recovery of my country from the horrible devastations of the Second World War. Without the United States, the Federal Republic of Germany would not have had a chance of belonging to the Atlantic community of free and democratic nations. This is what my generation never forgot, and this is what parts of the younger generations should always remember. In my country, the young have inherited prosperity and freedom, safeguarded human rights and the rule of law, social progress and economic opportunity, and as regards the whole of Europe, a peaceful period of unprecedented length. And this peace could be preserved despite the gigantic military buildup of the Soviet Union and in spite of the political and ideological expansionism of the Soviet and Communist bloc. The Soviet Union's growth of military strength, particularly the increased global mobility of its forces, allows it to exert pressure in many parts of the world. Soviet pressures on Poland and the invasion of Afghanistan point out that the Soviet Union is willing to threaten or to use force beyond its own frontiers. We know that the NATO alliance so far represented an effective guarantee for our common defense and for our deterrence posture. But looking ahead, we must realize that peace and freedom are not fortuitous gifts. They are a daily difficult conquest. They must be ever renewed. They must be earned. In this year, 1983, we have to meet formidable security and economic challenges. Our eyes are turned to Geneva these days, where the United States and the Soviet Union will, as we hope, work out an equilibrium in the fields of both the intercontinental and intermediate-range nuclear armaments. The Western aim is to attain the lowest possible equal levels. A mutual renunciation of intermediate-range missiles by the United States and the Soviet Union would correspond best to our interest in making progress in nuclear disarmament. We want peace with ever fewer weapons. We are well aware of the fact that one prime objective of Soviet policy is to try to get the German government not to implement the NATO decisions of 1979, to have an equivalent deterrent force of American intermediate-range missiles set up on German soil if by the end of 1983 the Geneva talks with the Soviet Union should not produce the desired results. The Soviet Union has engaged in a massive propaganda offensive directed at the Western Europeans. Its luring tones and thinly veiled threats are supposed to convince the West not to modernize NATO's arsenals, thus preserving the Soviet weapon monopoly achieved through its SS-20 missiles buildup. The Soviet Union attitude reminds me of the fable once told by the Spanish diplomat and writer Salvador de Madariaga. It is the fable of the animals' disarmament conference. There the lion, looking at the eagle, demanded that talons be abolished. The tiger, glancing at the elephant, suggested that tusks be forbidden. The elephant retorted that paws and fangs must disappear. After a while, the bear rose and in the most conciliatory manner proposed, "Comrades, we should do away with everything but the big brotherly hug." There is no doubting the resolve of the German government under the leadership of Chancellor Helmut Kohl to implement the so-called dual-track decision NATO took in 1979. During his last visit to Washington 2 months ago, Mr. Kohl made it abundantly clear that Germany will play her part in carrying through the deployment of US missiles on her territory if need be. And at the Williamsburg Summit Conference 1 month ago, the heads of state and of government of the leading Western industrialized nations reaffirmed their determination to guarantee the peace and security of our nations. They assumed the obligation before the whole world to devote their entire strength to achieving peace by significant arms reductions. The participants in Williamsburg agreed furthermore that the military defense capability of the Western Alliance is a factor for stability in international relations. Chancellor Kohl has made it clear that the security policy of the Federal Republic of Germany is the security policy of the Atlantic Alliance. So when we say we want ever fewer weapons, we declare in the same breath that we pledge not to use weapons, whether conventional or nuclear, except in response to aggression. We are willing, on the basis of reciprocity, to renounce a whole category of weapons, namely land-based intermediate-range missiles. That is the point of the zero-zero option, which we continue to regard as the ideal solution. On the road toward achieving that goal, interim solutions must remain possible. As Chancellor Kohl said before the German Bundestag 2 weeks ago, we are interested in a balanced outcome of the INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces, negotiations in Geneva, but not in a result at any price, not at the expense of our own security, not at the expense of our political independence, not at the price of endangering peace. With the same clarity, we say that the alliance's firmness and ability to act is the prerequisite for security, disarmament, cooperation and détente. We render our contribution to this by means of our solidarity in the Western Alliance. Chancellor Kohl will travel to Moscow in a few days, upon the invitation extended by Mr. Andropov. There again, he will tell the Soviet leaders that on the basis of a firm anchorage in the Western community, the Federal Republic of Germany will not play the role of intermediary or interpreter between East and West. We belong to the West by virtue of history, political, economic and cultural ties. This, of course, is not to say that the Federal Republic of Germany does not encourage more communication between East and West. With a border of 500 miles separating West Germany from East Germany, and thus from the Soviet-dominated sphere, in fact, my country possesses the longest common frontier between the two alliances, stretching from the Baltic Sea down to the Danube River. On both sides of that dividing line exists the strongest concentration of military forces, conventional and nuclear, history has ever seen. Any political tension between East and West would be felt first and foremost by Germany, be it in and around Berlin, or as regards existing human contacts between West and East Germans. We have therefore tangible stakes in the preservation of communication channels. Precisely because present-day relations are difficult and extremely complex, we need more and not less contacts. Our political goals and priorities are in complete agreement with the alliance policy based on firmness and readiness for negotiation. Both are fundamental to NATO's long-standing objectives of strengthening the peace and pursuing through dialogue and mutual advantageous cooperation a constructive East-West relationship aimed at genuine détente, as NATO's defense ministers reaffirmed at their Brussels conference 3 weeks ago. German Chancellor Helmut Kohl has emphasized, however, that the intensity of communication will be influenced by and dependent on further developments in Poland, the Soviet Union's actions in Afghanistan, and its behavior at the current disarmament negotiations. The transatlantic partnership, which for the last 3.5 decades has given the European continent stability and security, has every prospect of continuing to prove one of the most successful achievements of our common Western policy. There are times, though, when some public debate is based on the false assumption that Germans could or should choose between the Atlantic Partnership and an allegedly more independent German political cause. Take, for instance, the anti-nuclear movement in Western Europe, which is bitterly opposed to NATO's dual-track decision, which is against nuclear weapons in general, and critical, if not downright hostile, to NATO's existence. That movement is a multifaceted phenomenon which encompasses pacifist, Marxist, and environmentalist ideas as well as religious beliefs. There are also many in the so-called peace movement who, without rejecting the Western alliance and Germany's role in it, and therefore different from the anti-nuclear movement, are simply afraid of, as they perceive it, a senseless nuclear arms build-up in a militarily saturated region. Everyone who is concerned about peace and stands up for it will meet with our esteem and respect. Hence, we also appreciate the peace debate within the churches. Nevertheless, nobody should forget that our democratic state affords the freedom needed to discuss with all democratic means the right path toward peace. It is in keeping with our parliamentary democracy that questions of our foreign and security policy will continue to be decided on in the German Bundestag. Anyone who seeks to dispense with the principle of democratic majorities in the debate on the right path towards peace and seeks to replace convictions with force is undermining the foundations of our liberal order. Our peaceful order, which requires mutual tolerance, does not give anyone the right to regard his approach as the only one leading to peace. It becomes therefore worrisome when manifestations generated by the political anti-nuclear and peace movements psychologically prepare the ground for accommodation vis-à-vis the Soviet Union and ultimately for the big brotherly bear hug. That peace movement, to be sure, represents a minority in my country. The Greens, for instance, which in Germany absorbed a good deal of the anti-nuclear movement into their ranks, gained a mere 5.5% of the votes in the German federal elections of March 6th. In the same elections, the governing coalition parties, led by Chancellor Kohl, received more than 55%. These Bundestag elections can be regarded as a convincing confirmation by the German electorate of NATO's security policy and of the commitment the German population feels for the alliance and the bond of solidarity with the major ally, the United States. The European anti-nuclear and peace movement could acquire a political significance way beyond its current proportions if it were to close ranks with the American freeze and peace movements. Although both movements do not hold identical views, they could find common ground for action against the eventual deployment of US missiles in Western Europe and in particular in Germany. Moreover, as regards NATO's dual-track decision of '79, which the former government under the Social Democratic Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and the then opposing Christian Democratic Union once jointly endorsed, one misses a clear position among Social Democrats today. The second part of that decision, the deployment of new nuclear missiles in the event that the Soviet Union should hold on to its medium-range SS-20 build-up, is presently not fully backed by the Social Democratic Party, as it used to be when the decision was laid down by NATO and underwritten by the Allied Western governments. The German Social Democrats have postponed their decision on deployment until the fall of this year. If that party were to decide against deployment, the formerly existing consensus among the democratic parties on all major questions of security could come undone, causing a rift in Germany of almost historical dimensions in the domain of security and defense policy. Let me now turn briefly to the economic challenges I mentioned at the outset. Our defense capability and our readiness for East-West dialogue depend on economic and social stability being preserved in the West. Sound national economies are the prerequisites of political stability and strategic security. Some challenges have arisen in the field of international trade. Unwilling to let East-West trade result in a strategic imbalance to our detriment, we work together with the United States and our other allies to strengthen the embargo and controls on the export of goods and the transfer of technology which could be relevant for armaments. As the heads of state and of governments confirmed in Williamsburg recently, the degree of understanding reached in the multilateral organizations entrusted with devising a common approach is very encouraging. To give you one example, you may remember the gas pipeline issue on which Western Europe and the United States could not reach consensus at first. The nature and extent of that dispute between the United States and a number of European nations had been blown out of proportion. Now we can file it away as another problem overcome by joint efforts and close consultations. Despite these achievements, some problems remain on the agenda. Amid encouraging signs here and there that the economy is on the mend, the leaders of the major Western industrialized countries discussed in Williamsburg the revitalization of our economies and the fight against unemployment. Problems still strongly affecting us in our individual countries. We are all in agreement that lasting economic growth is required, which does not push up inflation again. We shall be able to sustain that growth if we can prevent protectionist tendencies from paralyzing the free international trading system. In transatlantic trade, the United States has sustained a surplus with the European community, which in 1982 figured at $3.5 billion. In the light of last year's $43 billion US trade deficit and of a possibly even substantially greater deficit for 1983, protectionist pressures on the administration and on Congress may be stronger than ever. However, the favorable transatlantic trade balance in the United States does anything but justify American protectionism. Furthermore, the US dollar continues to be very strong, which provides an opportunity for Europeans to increase their export on the US market. Protectionist measures, however, would eliminate whatever trade advantages may emerge. Also, the substantial capital drain from Europe, attracted by the high US interest rates, impairs the sorely needed investments in European industry. Hardly any productive investment can compete with the returns to be made on investments on the money markets. In view of these problems, the German government termed the outcome of the economic summit in Williamsburg encouraging, because of the common conviction that monetary and budgetary discipline is indispensable. Williamsburg is also encouraging because of agreement reached on the aim of halting protectionism and giving liberal world trade a new chance. President Reagan succinctly pointed out, we and our trading partners are in the same boat. If one partner shoots a hole in the bottom of the boat, does it make sense for the other partner to shoot another hole in the boat? There are those who say yes and call it getting tough. I call it getting wet. Let us hope that we stay dry. Let us hope that we are able to overcome the ever-existing protectionist threat to free trade. It should be our common objective to develop a relationship between a strong United States of America and a strong Europe.
Your Excellency, we thank you very much for your comprehensive and warm statement, and you promised to answer questions until shortly after 7 o'clock. We look forward to that with equal relish. I'll recognize you, and the ambassador clearly will answer the questions. Yes, sir.
Sir, from your experience in negotiating with the settlements, how would you assess the credibility of any commitment that they might make to the bilateral treaties and verified?
I think that in all negotiations, you have to strike a balance. As it is very often said, it must be mutually advantageous. No party can be, if it's a really good result of negotiation, no party can be entirely happy and no party can be discontent. So if that is a balance that neither got what it really wanted in full, but both got what they needed. If you have an agreement with the Soviet Union, I think it's important that it can be verified. And this is, I think, something which is perhaps, I would say, even more important than the credibility. Because credibility, then you put trust in someone. If you can verify the results and be sure that the results that you have achieved in negotiations can stay, then I think it's a worthwhile undertaking to enter into such negotiations and to conclude such agreement.
A follow-up question on that. You talk about verification. Does that mean that your government would recognize verification on site rather than by satellite?
I'm not really an expert. I can only answer such questions on the basis of its merits. The question is verification, yes or no? My answer is yes. the question how to verify by satellite or on site, I really don't know the question. That depends so much on the different items which you have to verify. Sometimes it's sufficient, perhaps, and I say that as a layman, if you have a satellite intelligence. And sometimes it's not sufficient. So it depends very much on the single item which you want to verify.
Yes, Mr. Stern?
Mr. Ambassador, you said that Chancellor Kohl was not going. You said that Chancellor Kohl was not going to Moscow to be an intermediary or an interpreter of the West to the Soviet Union. I think the previous Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, once did describe himself as an interpreter. Does this signify any change in the basic West German approach to Moscow? And could you also tell us what the Chancellor expects to accomplish in Moscow?
I think the present Chancellor made it very clear that he is a party of the West. And when he goes to Moscow, he does it as a member of the Western Alliance. There is no place to play the role of a third party. One party is the West, the other party is the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. And there is no place for Germany to be in between. We are going there, not just, we have no mandate to speak for the West as such, but everybody in the West can rely on our playing a role as a member of the Western Alliance. And that is what Chancellor Kohl made very clear by saying that he is no interpreter and that he has no specific German role to play. Now, what is he going to achieve? I don't know, but I think his objective is very clear. He goes there to make it abundantly clear to the Soviet leadership where the present German government and the Federal Republic of Germany stand in the present dispute on disarmament, on the negotiations in Geneva, and where our role and our place in the present world is. And I think if this message is accepted in the Kremlin, and at the same time recognize that the Chancellor is strong enough to implement NATO's decisions, that I think will be a good result. There should be no doubt about our willingness and our capacity to implement what we have jointly agreed upon in 1979 by drafting the so-called dual-track decision.
Yes, sir.
Well,
To repeat for those of you who didn't hear the question was on what grounds did the Soviet Union retain its prisoners of war after World War II, and what is the ambassador's opinion?
happy that you are so young not to remember the times. But after World War II, all victors kept prisoners, German prisoners. There were prisoners in this country also. I think the last left perhaps in 47, and not so lucky as the Hessians were after the War of Independence. They had to return first, and then they could return again to the United States. The Hessians were not forced to return first to Germany and then to ask for immigration visa. But now, after World War II, the German prisoners were kept in this country for some years, and quite a number of them came back here, and I have met several of them who have settled immediately after their release, and they returned to this country. Now, So the German prisoners after World War II were a common feature in Europe and in this country here, and in Canada too. And the Russians, as the only victorious power, kept their prisoners the longest. They kept Germans, they kept Hungarians, they kept Romanians, they kept Japanese, and they released them in the last moment. So most were released until early 1950, and then they kept about 30,000, which they, in a mock procedure, sentenced first to death and then to 25 years of hard labor, and they were released only in 1955 when Chancellor Adenauer, the first German chancellor, came to Moscow and resumed diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. So we were normal prisoners of war, and then we were just pawns in the hands of the Soviet Union. And the last 30,000 were really used for blackmailing, extortion, and so on. It was very gruesome history. And there were, I don't know how many million German prisoners after the war, I think almost 4 or 5 million. And of those who had been taken prisoners by the Soviet Union, I think quite a sizable number of them never returned.
Yes.
What do you think of the possibility of a reunification of Germany? And if such reunification takes place, how do you think it will affect the role of Germany vis-a-vis the United States?
Germany's division is a result of World War II and the then established occupation zones. The Soviets never agreed to let their zone of occupation join the other 3 zones, the American, British, and French zones, that were united in 1949 as the Federal Republic of Germany. So the Soviets established there, within their zone, a state, the German Democratic Republic. But that doesn't change the course of history forever. I think the German nation existed before 1945, and it will survive the present division. When this time will come, we don't know. We have always said that it is our political aim to have the nation reunited, but that we would pursue this aim only in peace and freedom. And when this day will come about, I think Germany will stay where the Federal Republic of Germany is today. And that means belonging to the West. But we can only foresee such a political change in Europe as general improvement, political improvement of the overall political situation in Europe. And I think then the question of how to see the Soviet Union would be different from how we perceive this country today. But there is no timetable, and we don't know, but I can only state and assure you that a nation which is proud of itself will never lose heart in pursuing the aim of being one again.
Does Chancellor Kohl have a different perspective on Germany's role regarding the Middle East than that of his predecessors?
Well, I recently addressed the American Jewish Committee, and I said during World War I, and that's also history, Turkey was an ally of Germany, and Germany then was able to secure the security of the Jewish settlers in Palestine at that time. Today, Germany is not a power which can influence events in the Middle East independently. So our role as regards the Middle East is a role which we play in the European community. The European community, the 10 member countries, have taken a number of initiatives in the last 10 years to influence, as we saw it, the peace process and to enhance the peace process in the Middle East. This time, when we had the presidency in the European community in the first half of 1983, we deliberately renounced any role of putting forward any initiative. The foreign minister did not visit, as all the other foreign ministers of the European community countries had done beforehand. He did not go to the various countries in the Middle East, and he said, well, the situation in the Middle East is such, we support the peace initiative by President Reagan. We have supported the Lebanon-Israel agreement. We have supported the Israel-Egypt treaties. We have supported the Camp David process. So we are supportive, playing not entirely the same role as the United States, but at the present time, I think we find ourselves in full agreement with the United States policy vis-à-vis the Middle East. There is no particular German role in the Middle East. We play our part in the community and in full agreement at the present time with the United States.
Yes.
In Soviet Union, they are quite willing to entertain dialogue about nuclear and missile warfare because it's costly. Is there going to be any dialogue reference to biological and chemical warfare that's occurring on, which is much cheaper?
There is a constant dialogue going on in the United Nations Disarmament Committee in Geneva on all these weapons, chemical weapons in particular. You might know that Germany has already in 1952 renounced production, possession, and of course use of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons. So we have none of them. And this goes back 30 years ago in 1952 when we really forsake all these weapons for indefinite time. But I think it's correct to say that the emphasis is laid at present time on nuclear weapons and to a lesser degree on chemical weapons, and not on the other weapons.
Mr. Jacobs?
Mr. Ambassador, you have spoken reassuringly and repeatedly about German loyalty to the West. But I believe at one point, in another breath, and maybe in another mood, you spoke of the consensus coming apart, coming unstuck. I wonder if you would give us a little more information on what you mean by coming unstuck and what the consequences of that might be.
We had a broad consensus among the major political parties in Germany. That is the Christian Democratic Union, the Social Democratic Party, and the Liberal Party. Since 1960, these three major parties whether in government or in opposition, had a consensus on our basic security policy, on our policy vis-à-vis the United States, vis-à-vis the European integration. So these areas were all covered by a broad consensus among the major parties. This year, we may see drifting apart of the Social Democratic Party from the consensus in the security field as far as the deployment of new nuclear missiles in Germany is concerned. The SPD is not the Social Democratic Party, is reaffirming its allegiance to the alliance and considers itself a strong ally and friend of the United States as a party, but differs on the NATO's dual-track decision. And if that comes apparent in the latter part of this year, it is the first time for 23 years that on a major security issue, the consensus among the major German political parties is not existent.
Sir. What your government can do depends a great deal on that consensus and on the people of Germany. And so I'm interested in the feelings of the German people on the ceaseless struggle. Do the German people feel intimidated by the Russians, and is there a growing feeling of hopelessness in the German people?
The polls taken, the most recent polls taken, confirm that the government, present government coalition, still musters a very strong majority. And also, an even greater majority of the people polled is in favor of our NATO policy and security policy. When it comes to specific questions as the nuclear missiles, it is the most debated issue in Germany today, because if the negotiations in Geneva fail, we have to proceed with deployment of INF. And there are a number of people, a considerable number of people who object to that. It is, in my assessment, a minority. Among this minority, there are quite a number of people who do not accept majority rule. I alluded to that in my statement. They say this is a matter which is so important, so vital, we cannot accept for moral and religious and ethical reasons the vote of the majority. We will follow our convictions, our conscience. And these people might even resort to violence. We have seen some of that over the last weekend in Krefeld. And I'm sure we can control this situation. What the government is doing is a policy which had been debated for the last 5 years. The majority of the people and Parliament has clearly voted, and this majority decision has to be accepted. And I think we have to go through this test of our democracy. We have to see that that the government, the democratic elected government, remains able to govern. A democratic government is not a self-government. It is a fully legitimized government, but it has to govern. It has to show that it is able to carry out the decisions which have been taken by the majority. And I'm sure that the present Chancellor and government and the government majority in Parliament, the parliamentary coalition, is willing and able to do that. In the course of the coming months, we face a number of difficult situations, and I think the government will act in all considered flexibility to see that whatever opposition and resistance is being demonstrated can be controlled, and controlled only by democratic means. By that, this government will carry out what the people have authorized it to do.
Yes, sir.
I have a question about the comment. I was interested in comments about credit protection and so on. And it strikes me that Germany is very, very dependent on exports and very, very dependent on industrial exports. And if indeed you have a credit protection specifically in the United States, and if you have, certainly have some crisis now, what does this do to Germany's sort of larger thinking about it overall, how this is oriented? Isn't a worldwide just as much of a threat to Germany as the whole weapons situation? And would perhaps Germany reevaluate its relations with Eastern Europe in light of a threat world perspective?
You are right in assuming that our economy is really very much dependent on free trade. We export more than a fourth of our GNP, and we are among the countries most export and import oriented in the world. So any protectionism runs counter to our vital interests. And so you will always find Germany in the forefront of free marketeers or free traders. Really, this is what we have to do. We are a country with very few natural resources. We have a skilled labor, and we have a great capacity for industrial production. But we need desperately to export and to import. If free world trade is impeded, it affects us immediately. At the present time, you have two tendencies here. The strong dollar, of course, is advantageous in very respects to the American economy. It gives all the tourists cheaper foreign currency to spend abroad, and the number of American tourists have considerably increased this year. So they are spending that. And it gives a strong dollar is also very helpful because it draws much foreign capital into this country. And I think there's quite a number of foreign capital coming into this country and helping finance investments in this country. So a strong dollar and real high interest rates are advantageous on one hand to the American economy. On the other hand, the strong dollar improves the export chances of Americans' trading partners. So at the same time, when this dollar is strong, the tourists are benefiting, the American manufacturers might suffer from it a little bit because then foreign competition becomes stronger. We can offer, with a strong dollar and a weak European currency, more goods on the American market to very competitive prices. If the American reaction would be, now we enjoy the strong dollar, but at the same time protect our markets, that would amount to having the cake and eat it. You must decide. If you have a softer dollar or a weaker dollar, then you can, of course, act differently. With a strong dollar, protectionism in this country would really be against anything a free market economy stands for. And we hope that no more protectionism as already existent will emerge in this country. We see so many trends of protectionism, and not only trends, really evidence of protectionism, hindering European exports to this country, that we hope very much that protectionism will recede and not progress. And that could create a very uneasy situation if a strong dollar would be accompanied by rising protectionism in this country.
If we're to end by 7:10, I think we'll have time for just 2 more questions. You've been very, very patient.
Thank you.
And first of all, then the gentleman there who missed his last chance. Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, how strong is the neo-Nazi movement in Germany today?
It has been counted during the last election, not in percentages, but in 0.1%. If you consider the National Democratic Party the successor of the Nazi movement, which is not entirely correct, but even if you do that, so there is no Nazi movement anymore. There is none. It's not there in our political life. It's never been. Never been. I know, and I think it's legitimate to view us very attentively and to see whether there is any resurgence of Nazism. But I really, even with a microscope, you can't find it now.
Mr. Ambassador, from time to time in the American press, a brief story appears to the effect that the member nations of the European community are negotiating towards forming a single federation. What advantages do you see in the states of Europe forming a single federation, and how soon do you think such federation might actually occur?
In 1957, 6 Western European countries created the European Economic Community. France, Italy, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And their aim was to create a common market with no internal boundaries, with an external tariff, and slowly and step by step developing into economic unity. It took us now, what is it, 25 years to progressively enlarging the 6-member creation of the European community into a 10-member community with Britain and Ireland, Denmark and Greece. And 2 more countries are negotiating entry into the community, Spain and Portugal. So these 10 or then 12 countries constitute, in the first place, a common market, and setting free all their initiatives on a big internal market with almost 300 million people. And from there we have said, and that we said in 1957 already, we want to progress to a political, to an economic, monetary and political union. The expression was union. What does the European Union stand for in the last analysis? I think it's first development in stages. Now we have common market, We have had setbacks in our development, but still, even the last European summit in Stuttgart proved that the community as such is, I think, a very sturdy animal. We will survive other tests, I hope, in the future. But to reach a political unity in the form of a federation of states, it's still a long way to go. We could have achieved that perhaps faster with the original 6 member countries, the so-called founding fathers of the European community. With 10 countries now and then with 12 countries, it is certainly much more difficult. But we hope that progressively the European countries will be able in the future to have more and more common policies. Now we have an entirely community trade policy. There is no single trade policy of any of these 10 member countries, just one policy. We have the same regulations or deregulations in the community for vehicles and for medicines and for pharmaceutical products. So we have gone already a long way to integrating our economies. We have had for the last 10 years political cooperation. What we say, we speak with one voice. And I explained that in the Middle East, the community, the 10 member countries are acting as one voice, as one single unit. We have done so in the United Nations. All the 10 member countries, although 2 of them are permanent members of the Security Council, but still the 10 members were able to speak with one voice. Not always. It's still a delicate achievement. But I think on that way, slowly but constantly, we might achieve a stage where we come to a European federation.
Mr. Ambassador, we certainly appreciate the unusual lucidity and sophistication of your treatment of a wide range of issues, and in the spirit of the ethnic and historical ties which you mentioned and the shared interests of our 2 states, we very warmly thank you for sharing